This is the Requiem Metal Podcast, episode 16, At the Gates.
Welcome to the Requiem Metal Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Hundy.
I'm Mark Rudolph.
And joining us today are a couple of special guests. One person who you've heard on a previous podcast from previous weeks. That would be Chris Dick joining us again. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
And a very special guest, writer, author, publisher, editor, metalhead, Albert Mudrian.
What's going on? My pants are ringing right now. It's a little awkward, but that's how I like to introduce myself. Bringing my pants to the table.
And we've all sort of been joined for a specific reason. We drove in, as some of you listening to previous podcasts know, we drove into Philadelphia, not just to record the Amorphous podcast, but also to visit upon the At the Gates reunion show that was opened up in New York last night. So depending on when this podcast goes to air, that would have been July 9th of Wednesday. So the four of us rode up there with a friend of ours who's not on this podcast, but we drove up last night and had a good rockin' time. It was all of us were sweaty in the pit, and we thought this would be a wonderful opportunity to bring a podcast about At the Gates, because we haven't really talked about the band yet, and we have sort of an expert in the area, many experts in the area of Swedish death metal here. And so, Albert, tell us a little bit about the background. I'm sure some of the podcast listeners are familiar with your book and magazine and stuff, but maybe just to give us that background. A lot of vibrating phones going on here.
A lot of important people here.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who, know how to turn things off.
Right.
I think a lot of people have become more familiar with At the Gates over the past few years, and not even so much through death metal or Swedish death metal, but just from the glut of mostly American hardcore and metalcore and post-death metal bands they've influenced.
Mm-hmm.
So their relevance right now is truthfully, it's probably higher than it's ever been before, even though the band hadn't been around for a dozen years leading up to this point. So I think that there's a new generation of kids who are in their teens or early 20s who didn't really know At the Gates. They just knew it vis-a-vis other bands like the Darkest Hours of the World or the Killswitch Engages or whomever, and it's really now like those kids are kind of getting turned on At the Gates, and for old folks in our 30s like us, we're just excited to see him again, and it's like and I think that was something that like you guys probably noticed too last night. It was a really varied crowd, like the ages. It was like really cool,
Mm-hmm.
It was the younger kids. It was people our age. It was God. I even saw people older than us. I had no idea that people could live to be older than us.
So the first four songs, I couldn't hear Thomas sing at all, just because everyone in the crowd was singing every lyric.
Yeah,
that was like unreal. I've never been to a show like that except for like Iron Maiden.
Yeah, no. They opened up. What was it? They opened up with Slaughter of the Soul, and I think they played Cold second, and it was just like, I was up in the balcony and hearing everybody sing along just sent like a chill down my spine, and I was like super excited, and it was just like it was you knew something special was happening.
Yeah,
and I didn't expect that. I mean, even as the set went on, the fact that there were some people who knew the words to "Raped by the Light of Christ," I was like, what?
Yeah,
like there's somebody standing next to me who knows this, and I couldn't find, With Fear I Kiss the Burning Darkness for under $25 in like
for years.
1993.
Yeah.
But I mean, again,
it's a strange generational thing, absolutely, and it brought me back. I mean, At the Gates was one of my first death metal, if not the first death metal show I ever saw, when I was still a senior in high school with Chris, actually, years ago, and I was 18 again, last night. We are all talking about that. We generally aren't in the center of, people pushing and mosh pits and all that stuff. I generally like to sort of stand back and just sort of enjoy myself at concerts and watch the band, but it was like the energy was there and it sort of sucked you right in. I mean, you were front row the whole show for most of it, right?
Yeah, the power of Swedish death metal compelled me.
Yeah.
I was, it was shocking. I mean, you get, and I don't want to turn this into something that's kind of industry-ish-y, but
go ahead, because you have a different perspective on this because you're part of the
right.
outsider, sort of metal industry now.
Right. So when you're when you're involved in a magazine or involved in the metal music industry, you're going to a lot of shows, and it becomes the kind of thing where, I mean, it's not that it's unexciting, but it's a little more routine.
After
you become jaded in a way. Like I don't get very excited about concerts nowadays, and I'm not even really in the industry. But being that Mark and I and Chris, used to go to metal festivals all the time, and exhausting, just waiting it out for like the 2 or 3 bands you want to see.
Right.
It's hard to get the motivation to get in a car and deal with the crap that you have to deal with when you go to some of these shows. But like you said, it sort of...
It was all worth it. It was all different kind of experience, and it just... I don't know.
I think we all felt young, too, which was awesome.
First show I've headbanged at in I don't know how many years.
Yeah. It become, when you're in a concert and it becomes sort of like a Darwinistic experience where you're just, fighting it out for survival, but yet still enjoying yourself, you're kind of in that old sort of metal mode,
Yeah, and I think that there were just a lot of factors that made it all work. Obviously that this is the first time anybody's getting a chance to see them in so long. That I think everybody knew they were going to be good. I don't think there was any doubt. Like, are these guys going to still have it? Are they going to be able to pull it off? Just because the fact that Anders and Jonas have been in the Haunted for so long, and Thomas between like Dysphere and the Great Deceiver and the Crown and just all the other things that he's been doing, and Adrian and Cradle, like these guys were tuned up. All they had to do was just rehearse for a bit and get it back together again. So having that, knowing it was going to be good, and also that, like, I think everybody in the room was aware that this was kind of just a fleeting moment, and you needed to latch on, you needed to catch it, and just fully immerse yourself and invest everything into it, because they've said this is it. They're doing this tour, they're not doing a record, and that's it. They're gone. So like, it's like, here it is. While you're here, just seize that moment. And I think that's definitely what I felt while I was there. And talking with Corey Grow, who's a friend of ours, a Decibel contributor, also was there last night. He had he definitely resonated the same.
Now we were sort of speculating on whether or not you think they'll probably cut a live album out of all this and then call it quits.
Yeah, I don't see why you wouldn't want to do like a live DVD or something like that. I mean, the only thing that is a little strange is, I don't think they're technically I don't know if they're contractually obligated. I don't know if they owe Earache anything else. And if they do, they might not be in a hurry to fulfill that.
Yeah.
And if they don't, I don't know who would put it out. I guess, they could potentially release it to Peaceville even.
Sure.
But, it's definitely something that's possible. I just don't know the ins and outs of that.
Now, being part of Decibel, you had a sort of an outside hand in kind of getting this event sort of together last night. Kind of give some of the listeners like a little bit of background on like your relationship with At the Gates, maybe through writing the book Choosing Death, and like how some of that sort of stuff kind of came together.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't really, I didn't really have any hand in like putting the tour together or, influencing them to, do a tour or shows or anything like that. Other than like, the occasional like email to like Thomas, like, hey, what would be cool? If I got to hear Kingdom Gone sometime, it'd be great. No, it was the kind of thing where, I didn't even know they were going to do it, because like, Thomas and I are friends and we talk, every once in a while, and when it was announced that they were going to play some shows and do, they first announced they would do some shows in Europe or something, And he emailed me like after it was announced, and he was like, "Hey," he's like, "I was sworn to secrecy by everybody with this, and it's like something we talked about, and we just decided to do it, and nobody knew, and we just put it out there like that." And I was like, "Okay, cool." And I was like, if you ever want to do, if you guys get a U.S. tour together this year, which I would think you probably would if you're gonna do these Euro dates, Decibel would be happy to sponsor it, and like Thomas is a good friend of the magazine, and he's like, I wouldn't want anybody else to do it. It's perfect. So we got involved really early on, and again, it's one of those other things where it isn't, there isn't a label behind the band, there isn't a manager behind the band, and the way the industry works is normally when you get those tour sponsorships, the label or the manager will come to you and say, "Hey, would you guys be interested in this?" Mm-hmm. And since there aren't those elements, it's up to the band to do that. So it was cool to feel like that we were wanted. I mean, the same thing is going to happen. Hopefully by the time this podcast is up, it'll be announced that there's going to be a full U.S. Carcass tour. Yeah. And the same thing happened with that, where we were told by Carcass we would be sponsoring this.
Well, I do remember the article though, the article that had At the Gates and Carcass, a year and a half ago, maybe, or
the pros and cons.
Yeah,
it was a couple of years ago.
I mean, I wonder if that you think maybe that planted a seed, or maybe it's what you were talking about earlier, in that they're more relevant today than they've ever been in some ways in terms of their influence on the scene, and maybe they recognized that and said, let's do it now because it's like the Zeitgeist, it's pushing us.
Yeah, no, I mean, there was a lot of factors. I don't think that Decibel suggesting or me suggesting has anything to do with it. It's just there are all these factors. There is a demand for it. I mean, for so many years, people have been saying how great it would be if Carcass did this, or how great it would be if At the Gates did this. And these guys, they're real people. They're not like, they don't turn a blind ear to this. They know that. Like,
they don't hate the fans.
They don't hate that. They know that people are like, this would be awesome if you did this. And they start thinking, it might be kind of awesome. And and for some of these bands, it's like they are conflicted because they want to keep a legacy intact. Yeah. They don't want to get back together and have it suck. They don't want it to, underwhelm people when it happens, if it happens. And a lot of these guys, especially in At the Gates, they all have active other projects, and they, that's very difficult to coordinate. Like if you've got if there are 3 bands who are real bands and have label deals, I mean, they have to adhere to certain production schedules, to releases and tours, and if you've got 3 of those that you're balancing, it's so difficult to kind of line it up to
get that permission to be able to do something like this.
Have that clear space. So it's challenging for them. So I think it's the kind of thing they make a decision, and it isn't until a year later that they can actually do it.
The stars align in the right sort of way.
I mean, I know Carcass was trying to, there's been a few very close false starts over the past couple of years with the Carcass reunion. This could have easily happened 2 or 3 years ago.
It's just interesting that, in my opinion, kind of the 2 most sort of sought after reunion bands in the extreme metal scene just happened to almost align at the exact same time, the exact same summer. It almost.
Well, we were talking about trying to do an At the Gates Carcass tour.
I mean, that would be monstrous.
I mean, I think that the Emperor reunion also sort of has a spark in this whole concept of reunion tours and what they're capable of. Obviously, the first Emperor reunion tour in the States, obviously, Sandlock wasn't able to attend a couple of those shows due to his legal issues. But I think that by Emperor doing it, it kind of proves the concept that by going out there, playing again, playing for people, you can actually recapture the magic you had back when you were a full-time band, putting out records, touring, being on a label, without a lot of other commitments. You're going out there, you're playing a show, and like you said, it's a moment in time, and it's really up to the band and the audience to capture that moment in time to make it something special. So I think that Emperor was sort of one of the. Well, I don't think it had any influence by any means on any of these other things, but I think it sort of proved a concept that it's possible to go out there and do it and be successful.
Well, I find it interesting
for people to talk about it positively.
Well, sure, and I find it interesting. I think it speaks very loudly to where extreme metal is and you could speak to this having done kind of a historical documentation of this, that like these bands now, I mean, we're talking, Carcass broke up 95 at the Gates, 97, 96, 97 era. I mean, we're now 10, 12 years, generationally, we're starting to get removed. I mean, it's almost like we've grown old with these bands, and there is, like you said, an increased demand for some of these older legendary extreme metal bands to sort of get everything together, and there's a market for that now, where 10 years ago, who would have gotten excited about any a Celtic Frost reunion in 94, 95?
Right.
Probably no one. Like it's Mark and I've talked about this on previous podcasts, where like it's almost like people who grew up with this music are now in the decision-making driving seat. We're like, that's why a book like Choosing Death is coming out, or Headbanger's Journey documentary, things like this. Like, those wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. There was no feasible market, because it was a bunch of skateboarders, 16-year-old kids, and people with no jobs, and I don't know if maybe culturally you think that plays a role in all that. I mean, having done a history of sort of death metal, I mean, are we in a kind of a unique time period for sort of extreme metal in terms of being able to look back at it?
Well, yeah, I mean, it didn't really even have that much of a history when we were kids growing up with it, I mean, it had some, and it was really, at the time, it was really transient. It's just like, okay, this is what I'm going through, and these are the bands I'm into, and I don't know what's going to happen next. And I think by the time you hit your late 20s and your early 30s, and you're
growing up,
God, your adulthood, you have a different kind of perspective on things. And like you said, as an adult, or somebody who could be mistaken for an adult, you have these opportunities to do things like, publish magazine, write books, help with tours, connect with bands, connect with, people, and get things done. And, there are these people that, like, it happens to everybody. I mean, there's people who, you can definitely progress with the times and, like, evolve and, listen to newer bands and be into newer bands, and I am. You guys all are too. But, there's obviously something that's always special about your first, love, the way you connect with this stuff. It's very difficult to ever, I think, it'll be really difficult to ever, like, recapture the enthusiasm for the first time you heard these bands, or the first time you went to one of these shows, or one of these records came through the mail from England that you got,
you paid $20 for it, and you sent cash in a folded envelope.
And it's like, and you don't want to be looked at as revivalists or people who are just stuck in the past, but it still means something, and it's what everything is happening now is built on, and you kind of feel a responsibility to let a younger generation know that, like, look, this is how it happened. Maybe you care, maybe you don't, but here's how it happened. And it's also good to not the people who are our generation to not let them forget that this is how it happened too. So I think there's, like, it is a unique position that we're in, and I guess we do have, like, some kind of responsibility to keep the history out there, but also not live too far in the past, which it's a tightrope. It's a very difficult line to walk, and I fall off it regularly.
Well, I almost feel like, in a sense, that, like, these are, like, it reminds me of our old manager Mike talking about when he was buying a lot of music in the mid 60s, and sort of rock and roll and all that stuff was the real rock and roll, not like sort of 50s kind of like Elvis and stuff, but like the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, like that whole scene was bursting upon people, and it was so new and so unique to a lot of people, and like you said, transient in a way. Like, Beatles were breaking up, Rolling Stones, people were dying and leaving, and you just didn't know if, like, everyone was going to hold on. And now, fast forward, to the late 70s, early 80s, and people can start to look back at that and, like, there's Rolling Stones or Keep Going, and like the reunion tours and Kiss's I mean, it's almost like, are these like our Beatles and Rolling Stones sort of figures, like the late 80s, early 90s sort of scene? Are they always gonna sort of have that imprint? Are people still always going to care about a new Entombed record, no matter how good or bad it is? Because it's Entombed. Like they get carte blanche almost to be like that. And At the Gates, Carcass, Morbid Angel, these kind of acts.
I'm hoping no one gets carte blanche to put out a record.
Well,
I think we've had several Entombed records which have been somewhere in the middle of good and bad.
Yeah. I was just speaking as a
but I think what I'm going to get to in this piece, I guess, is that there's a connectedness now that there wasn't when we were growing up. I think when we were growing up, there were magazines, there were people interviewing bands, all the stuff that goes on today. But I think it was very encapsulated in pieces. Like you had the English thing going on, you had the Swedish thing going on, and you had the American thing going on, and wherever else in the world it was going on, and it was connected through underground tissue. But I think now, because of the internet, because of the way we communicate to one another, which is a little bit different than we used to, I think it's much more. The connective tissue is much stronger, and there's much more of it. And I think if we're able to keep that strong, I think that there's no reason why we as the decision makers at this time, like our magazine editors of the past were decision makers back then, were able to make those bonds continually stronger. That's the way I think about it. We're continually, Albert, you're putting out Decibel, you wrote Choosing Death, you guys doing the podcast, I mean, freelance journalists writing pieces about whatever band they're writing about. I think they're making those connective tissues stronger and more prevalent. That's what I think about it.
Sure. No.
So I think we're just in a decision-making process now where we weren't so much in the past, like when we were growing up as high schoolers and stuff, or teenagers kind of discovering this music. We were more discovering as opposed to having a more mature, tempered set of vision.
Right.
We could actually go into it and make a decision like, I want to write a book about death metal. Like as a teenager, you'd be like, yeah, I want to do that. And you'd be like, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to sit there with my legal pad and write it out. Or go to Kinko's and rent, computer time to type it out on a Mac, an Apple IIe or whatever.
Right.
I think that it's much more feasible now for people to do that, and I think that, we're the decision makers now. We have the onus is on us to continue to preserve and also look forward.
Yeah,
for sure.
What do you think the longevity of the extreme metal genre has added to its validity at all in the mass culture?
The longevity that has been that is going to continue, or that it's been.
Yeah, people saying 91 might have thought this was just some weird little phase of music that would have gone out in 5 years.
Right.
Well, 94 or 95, death metal was supposed to.
Yeah, I mean, it's had all these almost death rattles for the last 10 or 15 years. Every 3-4 years, everything seems to kind of fizzle out. What's going to happen?
Yeah, but it's always the things that fizzles are always subgenres within the genres, and as long as there's something happening under the banner of as long as there's something happening under the umbrella of extreme metal, whether it's trends that pull black metal to the surface and then back down, and death metal up, or metalcore up and hardcore down, or whatever. I think you're always going to have that. You're always going to have the next thing, all these. I don't even know what they're called now. All these deathcore bands, all these kind of Suicide Silence bands, all these MySpace metal bands that I can't tell apart. That we try to find the good ones and cover. There's always. It's going to keep moving, and it's going to go through ebbs and flows, but it can't go away. It's
metal will never die.
No, it's too established now, and. There will be an ebb and flow in popularity, and we'll see it. We'll see it firsthand with Decibel, because it's our success in a lot of ways is predicated on how popular the genre is and the subgenres within the genres,
and how you respond to it.
Right.
Yeah, sure.
And what we cover and what we do with it, and
trying to find that movement as it's bubbling to the surface and sort of grab on and be part of it,
right,
instead of ignoring it or something.
And at the same time, making sure you or being true to your original aesthetic with what you're doing. You know, I mean, like, if we wanted to, I'm sure whatever the hell was happening that was big. Sad thing is, I don't even know, like Bullet for My Valentine or something. You know what I mean? You put them on the cover. You know, and like, I know we're putting Dragon Force on the cover, but at least I think, to me at least, they still like kind of fit within the aesthetic. And
they're still metal.
They're still metal. They're fun. They actually have like black metal roots.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's like, not to get off the subject here, but like, I do think it will, it will continue. It will ebb and flow. I think it's probably going to take a little bit of a downturn, but the other thing that is just difficult to predict is just the overall future of the music industry and music retail, and
absolutely,
and
this big
CDs,
change is coming.
Yeah, CDs as the preferred medium to sell this stuff. I mean, I'm sure Chris, with your day job, I'm sure you see these charts and you see what's selling and what isn't, and right now, I mean, metal still, as far as like physical CD sales and stuff, still sells.
Right.
And I mean, that Opeth record, Opeth had a top 20 album.
Yeah.
How crazy is that? I mean, like, and it isn't, I mean, I don't want to discredit them because they've obviously worked and got to a level, but it's like, the Opeth's rise and the music industry's decline, it's kind of meeting halfway to get them to that kind of status where you can have a top 20 record.
Right.
So, like, there's just so many factors to kind of determine how popular metal will be, and I guess it's all about context, really.
Sure.
It might be extraordinarily popular if you just look at physical CD sales in a few years.
I think it will continue. There'll always be ups and downs, but I think the most important thing about metal is that it's a global thing. And I believe it was Jelly Biafra who was saying, like, what he's not really a big metal fan, but I think he was quoted as saying, like, the cool thing about metal is that no matter what country and no matter what culture you're in, you're always going to find someone who will sort of throw up the universal signs of metal, whether it be the horns, the pentagram, or a spiked armband or something like that. It's a universal thing. And it doesn't matter what the language is. You can go into a country and speak no language, but somehow you're able to communicate through music, through the style of music. I think that's the powerful thing.
Yeah.
And I think as long as bands continue to put out quality music, regardless of style or genre, and people continue to be receptive to it and understand it and appreciate it, then I think it will continue. There's always going to be, there's the thrash metal boom, there was a death metal boom, there's a black metal boom. And I think, it all goes in phases. But I think it will continue.
Sure. Yeah. And we've talked about that before with Sepultura, about the global metal sort of scene, and just they were one of the first bands to sort of globalize, I guess, because they were coming from a completely different, non-Anglo oriented place, But kind of, not that the Detour wasn't a cool place to go, but sort of
our McLaughlin group metal.
Yeah, exactly.
Issue number 2.
Issue number 2 at the gates. But kind of to bring us back to at the gates and kind of what we saw last night and stuff like that. We've sort of all given our personal like metal histories, or why we got into metal, what we were listening to, what sort of was our gateway and stuff. Where did you kind of come into it in terms of getting to, like, say, At the Gates and sort of the beginnings of the Swedish metal scene?
I guess it would technically be like a late bloomer, because I was like 91.
Okay.
Like kind of getting into stuff. I guess, like, if you want the whole sordid history, I guess, you're looking at the, like, like a real gateway band for me was like Sepultura,
Sure.
you just mentioned, like records like Beneath the Remains and Arise. Like Arise was like a real, like,
huge.
And, it's like Arise, and then it's like, you got a friend who's like, oh, if you like that, you should check out Obituary. It's a bit heavier, but, you might be, you might check it out. And it's like, all right, I'll buy Cause of Death, because Cause of Death was the most recent one.
Yeah.
So you get Cause of Death, and it's like, you make your transition to the vocals, you're like, okay, that's kind of awesome. And then it's like, Napalm, and then it's over. You're doomed for life. I think for me personally, At the Gates was probably more like a 91, 92 thing. And I think that was more like kind of. I mean, I probably got into them in some way, probably because like Paradise Lost, you know, and the Gothic record and Peaceville stuff, and
pulling out the peaceful like pamphlets and what else is
so
on the
probably,
label?
I mean, it was. I there's no way I heard them before '92, and you know, then Red in the Sky Is Ours would be the first thing that I would have gotten. I'm guessing what year was Peaceville Volume 4? Is that '92?
'92.
Yeah, I mean that probably Kingdom Gone from Volume 4 would be my first exposure to them. You know,
I think it was our first, you know, like for those who heard Volume 4, I think that was probably our exposure to a lot of those bands.
Dark Throne and everything.
Dark Throne.
Yep.
What else was on that? And then I think shortly after that there was a death metal.
The death metal
which was which was even the more underground version of which the first time you heard Dissection, for example.
Eucharist, the View.
Eucharist, the View.
Incredible song.
You know, what was the other stuff on there? Nightfall, More to Skull. You know,
More to Skull.
Yeah.
Still kicking.
Now, you guys, when did you guys get into At the Gates?
I would say we're probably, strangely enough, probably around the same time under the same circumstances.
Yeah.
It was almost like a parallel universe, really, like hearing Albert talk about him discovering, you know, bands either through flyers or through Volume 4. So I think we all went through that, you know, that weird somehow discovery process.
Yeah, the pre-internet era, like everything was just like
What you
thing would lead you to the next.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, we definitely weren't into Grotesque when Grotesque was active. We were, you know, we picked up on At the Gates at Red in the Sky Is Ours. And I remember because you know, we got the peaceful version, then we got the grindcore version, which came out later.
Oh yeah, I remember the
licensed
grindcore version.
Yeah. I think that's one I have still. Yeah, I have both. But we discovered At the Gates, and I think once you heard it, you were like, "What the hell is this? This is incredible." It sounds like nothing. It doesn't sound like any of the American things you heard before, or the British things you heard before, which was very like meaty, thick, you know, manly death metal. And there was nothing. There was the melodic sensibilities were kind of subdued and very, you know, carefully placed. Whereas with At the Gates, it was like you're listening to like death metal with classical sensibilities. You know, it's almost like as if your parents, if they would have heard it, they would be like, "Oh, I can see the musical value in that." Whereas if they were to hear Bolt Throw, they'd be like, no, "Not so much."
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very true, you know.
You know, there was a violin player, for example, on the At the Gates on the first album. He was a session player, but you know, that was a huge thing. You're like, a violin player with death metal.
It was crazy.
So there was like all these just counterpoint melodies coming in from every different direction. It was fast as hell.
And I mean, Thomas's vocals were different. He sounded different than. I mean, they weren't as refined as like, you know, the style that he has. That I guess that he's kind of known for with Onslaught of the Soul.
True.
But like, it was still a different approach.
It was a scream instead of a growl.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that was really attractive. I mean, it was something different. It was something new. You know, you had bought, you know, the Entomb record, Left Hand Path, and it was great. You probably had bought the Dismember record. It was great. Grave, Unleashed, etc., etc. Therion, Carbonize, whatever. I think the minute you heard At the Gates, it was like, you know, something changed. You know, your eyes opened a little wider than they had been before.
They're almost like a Sepultura. How like anybody, like I remember in high school, people that didn't even really get into metal like loved that Arise record. I mean, everybody had T-shirts, everybody buying the CDs and everything.
Yeah, Rise was kind of like like Cowboys from Hell in that regard.
Yeah.
It was sort of like that next step. You know, it was like Cowboys from Hell, and then you had Arise, and everyone.
And then Cause of Death was like the biggest gateway, I think.
They were
true death metal record, you know, of the era.
Yeah, just a lot of people I know that are
Spiritual Healing was a big thing too.
Yeah, huge metal fans just really got in. Like something by At the Gates just like kind of captured their imagination. They're like, well, there's something really unique about this.
They had so many other elements that were just so much different. You know, like they had, like looking back, the lyrics on those first two records. The lyrics on those first two records are just so much different than the other death metal bands of that time. Like.
It wasn't all fantasy kind of death killing vibe.
No.
It was like poetic.
Yeah, it really was. And you know, it's like there weren't bands offering that up. I mean, they're like, you know, in retrospect, to look now, maybe the more esoteric stuff, like, you know, My Dying Bride and things like that. But like, yeah, they weren't really singing about Satan. I never really knew what the hell they were singing about. To be honest with you. But like, but it was cool. I knew it was cool, and I knew that like. You know, I knew there's a record called "The Red in the Sky Is Ours" and "With Fear I Kiss the Burning Darkness." I was like, I don't know what the hell that means. It sounds cool, and you know, like their logo looked different, and I don't know.
Artistic sensibility was completely different.
Yeah, there's
Just
something.
the red cover and the blue cover. I mean, just it was not people getting hacked up.
Yeah,
and,
it was different, and you knew it was more sophisticated. You didn't know exactly why because you weren't sophisticated enough to understand why it might be, but you knew it was different.
And it kind of raised you up on a. I don't know. I always like thought of like when I bought like say Orchid or Skydancer or like old At the Gates. It was like I could show this to my non-metal friends and be like, read the lyrics. What do you think about that? It's like a poem, isn't it? Yeah. Whoa, this is why is there a picture of a flower on a death metal record? Like, oh, you should hear the acoustic guitars or the violin
or the piano solo.
Yeah, things like that. And it was a very unique band for sure in that that time period.
I mean, I think a lot of the Gothenburg bands, talking about At the Gates and Eucharist and other bands, they were inspired by two things. I think they were inspired by classical music like Vivaldi and. Vivaldi. I know Eucharist is definitely inspired by Vivaldi, but they're also greatly inspired by British band Sabbath. Martin Walker and his, the guy never shut up because his lyrics, like I think one song was like 2 booklet pages in the CD, and I think that a lot of those Gothenburg bands were thrash based anyway, or before they got more refined.
They were kind of part of the German thrash.
Yeah,
they were really influenced by
they were into Creed, they were into Sabbath, they were into the European thrash sound, and I think they took that to a different place. By being isolated from Stockholm, it's not that far away really, but by being isolated, they just sort of created their own scene, and it's really weird. East and West on Sweden, you have 2 completely different sounds, kind of like in America. The thrash sound in New York is completely different from thrash in the Bay Area. Anthrax is much different than Testament. I mean, it's really easy to tell that.
Right.
So,
and like you said, like those long sort of almost like seamless lyrics where it wasn't built around chorus, not until like they get to like say Slaughter the Soul and they're really simplified and refined, but like those early, At the Gates, Gothenburg kind of records meandered, like we were talking about Skydancer from Dark Tranquillity and like how there's no repetition of any lyric. You were saying that yesterday, I think. Like how in the hell did that guy even remember any of the lyrics? Because there's like no repetitious patterns, or it's just constant flow of music.
It's like Canterbury Tales set to death.
Yeah, something.
Scott Hall would approve of that.
Yeah. Scott Hall, a big British lit guy?
No, he in a recent Decibel issue, he took some shot at Opeth.
Oh, Canterbury Tales. Yes, I remember that. Yeah.
It's actually pretty funny.
It was pretty funny. So in talking about At the Gates, we should maybe mention, I guess, who the heck's in the band, just in case anyone's kind of interested. We mentioned Thomas Lindberg, the very famous vocalist,
right.
The brothers.
Yeah,
Anders and Jonas.
Bjoller.
And for the first EP and the first 2 records,
Alf Svensson.
Yeah, I mean, he was. There's really, and I think most people who are like pure At the Gates fans, not just fans of a certain record, notice the clear divide between like the first 2 records and the last 2 records, and what kind of style Alf had, and like he was. He wrote a lot of the song. He wrote a lot of the stuff, and he had such a different kind of angular approach to playing that. Those first 2 records, and especially with Kyrie Kiss the Burning Darkness, was a very difficult album.
Absolutely.
Like I could not penetrate that album for years. Like it was like there's like when I still listen to it, there's still stuff that like I just can't like. I can't get my head around.
It's not a comfortable listen.
No. The fact that like the production is horrendous doesn't doesn't help.
Who produced those their early stuff?
There's
just unnameable guys. No one particularly famous.
I can't remember their names. It's the guy who did with Red in the Skies Ours. Apparently, it's like the only metal record
he's ever done. It kind of shows.
Well, I think all those bands at the time were doing that. They were going to studios because they were available.
Right.
Like it wasn't like he went to like Thomas Skogsberg because he produced death metal. They just went to like I think Dirk completely the same thing. They went to another studio. They didn't go to Fredman. They just went to like a studio and like produced a record. And it was like, okay, this is what we have. This is what we have to work with, and they did it.
Right.
It wasn't like it wasn't a popular choice to go to.
Yeah, you had very limited options whoever could possibly not laugh you out of the studio.
Skogsberg didn't produce the second At the Gates, did he?
I don't think he did.
No, I don't think he did either.
There's only some way to find out.
Only some way, some source that exists that we could type things in, find information.
Maybe in the future.
Yeah. Maybe.
But so there was Ulf and Adrian
Erlandsson.
Erlandsson. See, that's why we have.
You rely on Chris for all Swedish pronunciation.
Pretty much, yeah.
Who was the drummer who was the short-haired drummer,
right?
Which was always like
with Ken Owen, yeah.
Hey, look, there's the short-haired guy.
It's like the tennis player in the metal band.
Yep. Yeah, he was the short-haired guy, and I gotta say, I'm a little bummed that he had to grow out his hair for Cradle, and now that he was out, I was hoping he'd hack it off, but
he must have grown in love with the locks.
Yeah, he could have given them to Thomas, and Thomas could have dreaded them.
That's true. When we saw Thomas the first time, Chris and I, he had the long red dreadlocks. I've
been trying to convince Jeff Walker to go back to the dreadlocks for the Parkus reunion, but he does claim.
What about extensions?
I don't know.
Can you do dread extensions?
He does. He does say that he still has the actual dreadlocks, that they're in a bag in the attic.
That's disgusting.
You heard it here. You heard it here, folks.
Yeah. I can give anybody who wants to email me Jeff Walker's address, and you can go to his house.
Rummage through.
Find out for yourself.
Yeah.
I don't really know how to categorize Adrian's playing as a drummer, because it like from those first two records, again, so much different than what it evolved to.
I think Adrian was drumming in unison with Alf's completely, out of this universe playing style, and I think he was a very precise drummer, very clean,
very hard.
What's that?
Seems like he plays his entire body instead of more loosely. But we didn't know that when we were listening to the record. No.
Seen live. But you listen to that record and you listen to the drumming, and it sounds different from the bash. It doesn't sound like he's bashing on the drums. It sounds like he's actually playing around this strange tapestry of riffs that somehow are connected together.
Could we dare say? I hate to throw this word out because it always brings me back to like Spinal Tap or something, but there's almost like a jazz progressive sort of feel in terms of like some of the things, especially in Red in the Sky Is Ours. Like I always felt like
he wasn't playing just straight.
Yeah, and I'm not
pushing more.
Exactly. I don't know if that's off the cuff.
No, it might be. I don't pretend to know anything about jazz, so I always would just say it's a very angular style. It's like just not straightforward, or it's atypical of. Not that death metal was a straightforward.
No. Atheist
style to begin with, but there was what they were doing was not what pretty much 90% of the other bands were doing at the time.
So would you guys typify then those first Gardens and Red in the Sky with Fear? Like how would you typify them? Like obviously we talked about the drumming and Alf's sort of compositional style, but like obviously there's the kind of twin lead melodies that were sort of prevalent, sort of bouncing in and out of a lot of the songs.
Yeah, and the thing about it is they never really at that period they didn't overdo it. They wouldn't like shower you with melodics. Like they would pop up, to kind of like grab your attention and then disappear on you. They didn't stick with things for too long.
Like I think of like Neverwhere, where like it would go into that just like really melodic part, but then kind of come back out and go back at
very quickly. That was. Again, I don't know who was doing stuff like that at that time, but it wasn't like when somebody says melodic Swedish death metal or the Gothenburg sound, you don't think of those kinds of things. You don't think of the first two At the Gates albums. Even though they had an influence on that, they're not prototypical of that sound, where if you say the Stockholm sound, it's like okay, boom, Left Hand Path, or I can't believe how like never flowing through. It's been a long day. I'm on 3 hours of sleep. I just sent the latest issue of Decibel to print this afternoon, so forgive me.
That's all right.
His ears are ringing and his fingers are burning.
Yep. But it's difficult to categorize like what you would call. I don't know what Chris, what would you call those first two records?
In fact, I would call them Gothenburg death metal. I would call them, and I don't think anyone really knew that Eucharist was sort of like very inspirational to a lot of those bands because they were so young and so different. But I think I would call, Gardens of Grief and Red in the Sky is Ours Gothenburg death metal. And I think, because it may signify that there's actually more than one style of Gothenburg death metal. I think they were the most different of those style of bands. Whereas you had In Flames coming in early on, and they were more like, they were melodic, almost overly so. But they were still aggressive. They just had the aggressive side, whereas at the Gates were melodic, but not at all. They were melodic. They were more aggressive than melodic. And then if you had Dark Tranquility, I think we're sort of somewhere in between those two bands. And even if you listen to all those records, there's a lot of things that sort of connect them together. Well, one is melody, obviously. 2 is aggression, and 3 is a playing style which is very clean and concise. Those records they cut very easily. They sound like they're razor sharp.
I think that comes from the thrash kind of background.
Absolutely. I think it comes from the thrash influence. They weren't influenced by the Repulsions and the Deaths and the Montes and the Obituaries or the Executioners of the world. Celtic Frost, for example, they weren't the genesis. There was something else coming from that.
Right.
So I would call those definitely Gothenburg death metal.
Like All Life Ends, which they played last night. Hearing that live, I turned to Mark and I said, I always put At the Gates in Gothenburg, but that song, and maybe because Gardens of Grief, they're so young and just it was the progenesis of all this stuff, but it very much had sort of an undertone of Stockholm kind of sound to it, probably because that was the only thing, if you're a bunch of young Swedish teenagers, that's the only thing you know how to really play at that point,
Right.
And I just see, even though there are elements on the Gardens of Grief EP that suggest it, they were going to move in a different direction. It really became clear on Red in the Sky is Ours, and then with Fear, I don't know if you guys agree or disagree on that.
I almost thought With Fear was almost a regression. I thought it was a conscious regression.
It was hard to listen to when it first
because it was so raw, and they did the Discharge cover. It was almost like as if they were trying to dirty up the sound.
Yeah.
And obviously Alf left midway through the recording, so obviously there was some friction between the songwriters and those young guys trying to figure out, what do we do next? Here we are in the studio, we're spending money, we're burning money, and we don't have a cohesive idea of what we want to do. And I think at that point, Alf and the songwriters, whether it be Anders, Jonas, or Adrian, or whoever, clashed. And Alf said, "Well, I'm going to go do Oxford Plagats," which is really hard to say. And I can be as weird as I want to without anyone, talking, taking my stuff and saying, "No, what I want to do that."
Right.
And that's what they brought in Martin Larsson, halfway through the recording from House of Usher, to play on that record. And I think, like you said, it's a really difficult record, and I think that the production, which sucks, the songwriting, which is convoluted, Thomas's vocals just seem completely
they're lost.
They're ragged. It's like it's almost like the last dying breath of someone who's completely frustrated with everything in his life. There's almost no melody to it. There is melody there, but it's so encased in aggression and frustration and a crappy production that it works, but it's completely different from its predecessor.
Yeah. I wasn't in love with that album when it came out. It wasn't like
Ever Opening Flowers, the first song I attached myself to.
Really?
Yeah.
Right by the Light of Christ, I think I hooked onto pretty quick. Primal Breath. Although not till years later did I really link onto Primal Breath.
But I don't know, man. I that record, it was it confounded me for a long time. But I don't want to move too far ahead. But Terminal Spirit Disease was a year later. Those records are all 92, 93, 94.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it's crazy that they were able to kind of take such a 180.
Yeah.
Really, with Terminal Spirit Disease.
It's the brothers,
right?
Who
taken over,
who took it over and steered the ship in that direction.
They were definitely thrash fans.
Yeah, absolutely. They wanted to take it to make it concise, make it quick, make it pro. Instead of making it convoluted and unattainable.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
I mean, really, that's probably their most melodic record.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I mean, obviously, everybody knows that Slaughter of the Soul is catchy as sin, but, like, you know, there's just, like, so many layers of melody with Terminal Spirit Disease.
Right.
So,
The title track, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
Forever Blind stuff. I don't want to get too far.
Right, yeah.
What we should probably talk a little bit about maybe some of the songs from that early era that they played last night, kind of what your thoughts were on some of them, and then maybe throw a couple samples out to the listeners of maybe a couple really representative songs of that era.
Right.
You know, so what were your thoughts? I mean, they played All Life Ends,
All Life Ends, Right by the Light of Christ,
Windows.
and
With Fear I Kiss.
With Fear I Kiss the Burning Darkness.
Yeah.
I thought they were great.
It was nice to hear that old stuff.
It was pretty interesting to watch Thomas say, you know, do you want to hear something old? And he said, this is Right by the Light of Christ. And, like, people went, like, yeah, okay. You know, I mean, I don't think a lot of people are really familiar with the first two records as much as they are with the latter two. And my only disappointment with those two things is I thought that at least that's what my ears were saying at the time while I was fighting off Sweat and BO and all these other things, was that someone turned up Jonas's bass or someone turned down the two guitars. Because the minute Right by the Light of Christ started, like Jonas's or Andrew's bass was just like with Jonas. It was completely just like, and it was
really hard to hear.
It was really hard to hear the intricate melodies that were going on because you could hear or see rather, you know, Anders and Martin playing these riffs, and you just couldn't hear them.
Yeah.
But, you know, be that as it may, you know.
right.
And that's a really personal song in a way, too, because honestly, I don't even know if I had With Fear when you and I saw them back on the tour with Napalm Death. And it was quite a small venue. We saw them in Grand Rapids, Michigan at the Reptile House, and it was July 4th. And
yeah.
it was pretty neat. And that song, that was my first experience as a teenager, being a senior in high school. I think I was telling you this yesterday, that was the first time, you know, like Chris took us on the tour bus and we're hanging out. We went to Wendy's with Martin and, you know, hanging out with Jesse Pintado from Napalm. You know, he's grilling burritos and eating them next to us. And, like, you know, you were used to all that, but, like, that was so eye-opening to me. And then going in and watching them play, and Thomas was like a panther almost, the way he was, like, sort of, you know, prowling around the stage, doing these almost like Spider-Man kind of like down low center of gravity kind of moves. Yeah. Very crustcore kind of stuff.
He didn't smile quite as much back then as he.
Yeah, exactly. He probably wasn't getting those royalty checks. Yeah, you know, but
he still might not be.
No, that's true. It was your rate. It was your.
I think what's the song with 22 years of pain?
Yeah, but
I think all, you know,
but that song, Right by the Light of Christ, that was the song they dedicated to us, and that was the first time I had ever heard it. You know, and being a 18-year-old in high school, when a band says, you know, this next one goes out to Chris and the Requiem guys from Mount Pleasant, it's Right by the Light of Christ, you know, my immediate thought is, wow, what would my mom say?
Right.
And two, this is badass. I need to check this song out, you know. And so hearing that again years later, I had a greater sense of appreciation of it for sure, you know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't want to dwell on anything negative. I mean, like, but for me, like, it was the song that they didn't play from that era.
Absolutely.
They were supposed to close with Kingdom Gone, and according to Martin, who, you know, I saw after the show, he said that they were very hot and exhausted.
Just overheated.
They cut it, and he said if they played it, it would be horrible. And I said, more horrible than not playing it at all? Well, maybe not. I was like, well, to everybody who's there tonight, I hope they play it.
Yeah.
But I mean, that would be the only negative thing I'd have to say about that show at all. That people didn't get that. But I mean, the fact that they played All Life Ends, the fact that they played a song from the Gardens of Grief EP,
and the fact that they played it faster than
and it destroyed. That song was ridiculous. Yeah. And like hearing that, you know, I don't know, hearing that song. I just can't believe I saw At the Gates last night and they played All Life Ends.
Yeah, revert back to your 18.
And Windows.
Yeah.
Windows is something kind of just out of left field.
Yeah. That was
sounded great, too.
I mean, he said, this is Windows, and I just turned and looked at Jason, and I was like, what?
Yeah, I mean, there's
like, am I really hearing when they're going to play Windows? Like, what?
Like, there are other things that you would thought that they might play first from, Red in the Sky is Ours.
Sure.
You can think of a bunch of things, in fact, that they probably could do. Even the title track. But, those older songs, it was great. You knew they'd play The Burning Darkness. Such a short song and so few words and such a weird song.
Right.
Gives them a break almost.
Yeah.
Like it's like the,
But no, getting songs from that era, just, it was great.
It was like a nice cap to the songs you knew they were going to play. You knew they were going to kick ass on. It was nice to hear them sort of give a nod to not just the album that everyone has to love and must love, but the albums that really helped build the At the Gates legacy.
It was really, it was throwing, it was giving it something nice to the really true dedicated fans, not the
throwing a bone to
naysayers.
People in their 30s.
Yeah. Or just not the people who only bought Slaughter of the Soul. Just not all the bands that bought Slaughter of the Soul, started a hardcore band,
right?
Stop there, maybe listen to Terminal Spirit Disease once or twice. It was nice to hear those sort of songs.
Yeah. Bands that may have been on the bill even that maybe haven't heard those first two records.
Possibility. It's a possibility. What would you guys say then? Like a couple of songs from that era that you think are most representative of those the first, the EP and the first two records. What are a couple that come to mind when you're thinking about them?
I think we've already said them.
Yeah.
Kingdom Gone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kingdom Gone is such a. It was on volume 4.
And it appeared live on Terminal Spirit Disease, so newer fans kind of got a taste of it.
Right.
There's a video for it too.
Yeah.
And when they played it on the Dissection tour, Moranger tour, Dissection and Moranger tour, it's one tour. And then when they played it on the Napalm Death tour, it was one of those songs that, it's the first song that you attach to on Red in the Sky is Ours, no matter where you live. If the album's on shuffle and it's the last track, you're going to latch onto that one.
Yeah.
If it's the first song, you're going to latch onto it. So, hearing that song back then played live, then on the CD, that is the representative track from that record.
Sure.
And unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to hear it.
I'll get over it.
Well, let's listen to it right now. We're going to hear All Life Ends, Kingdom Gone, and Right by the Light of Christ. And All Life Ends comes from the Garden of Grief EP. Kingdom Gone comes from Red in the Sky is Ours, and Right by the Light of Christ comes from With Fear I Kiss the Burning Darkness.
Chaos God. Kingdom God after this. But I'm up against it. With a sound that comes far from you. And then you stop and I'm not doing it. When I put you we want your
Welcome back. You just heard All Life Ends, Kingdom Gone, and Raped by the Light of Christ. Give me a smattering of songs from the early years of At the Gates, and we're going to sort of end things with that because we kind of have a feel like Albert was saying that practically everyone in the metal world is terribly familiar with Slaughter of the Soul. And
if you're not, you should be.
Yeah, if you're not, you should be. And certainly those of you who really appreciate that style on Slaughter of the Soul should go back and get some of these early stuff, but especially Terminal Spirit Disease because it fits into that same kind of camp as Slaughter of the Soul in terms of being more of a straightforward melodic thrash metal record.
Oh yeah. That's the transition into, they can't
into the album.
Right. Yeah, they can't get to. They need that point B to get to point C. C being Slaughter of the Soul, which even though we're not going to go into in great depth, obviously it's a great genre-defining all-time classic, but it's the kind of thing that's like why should we sit here and talk about Rain and Blood?
Sure. Everybody's heard it. Or
congratulations. Yeah. You like Rain and Blood. So, no, I agree. And the Terminal Spirit Disease is that I love that record. I love it. And I still have this. You probably have one of these. When Peaceville was allegedly going out of business in 1994, the end of an era Peaceville tape. Do you have one of these? No. It's like a blue cassette, and one side is all Peaceville stuff, and the other side is all Dreamtime stuff.
Okay, I don't have one. I think I used to have one.
I may have another one. I'll see if I have more than one. But
can you part with it for not $100?
Yeah. I can get a buy it now together. But there was the song on that from At the Gates was Fevered Circle, which I guess they put this thing out right even before Terminal Spirit Disease was released. I remember hearing that for the first time and thinking, wow, I have no idea what's going on with this band. Because, going from those first two records and, as you said earlier, kind of regressing a little bit, not even creatively, just I guess commercially, or I don't even know, I can't even think of a
they made themselves more difficult to listen to. Yeah.
They were less accessible with the second record, and then doing something that was just like even more accessible than the first record that they did. I remember immediately tracking down a copy and ordering Terminal Spirit Disease after that. And then everybody knows Slaughter of the Soul is good.
Sure, and which and I'll give you a chance for a plug. I feel like Jon Stewart here, But which issue of Decibel? If people are more curious about Slaughter of the Soul, can they read about?
You can read about that. I believe it is issue number 5, which is our March 2005 issue with Morbid Angel on the cover, and we have there's a box of them down the hall, so you can order them online if you want to check it out. It's a great story, and it was actually the Earache bonus DVD for Slaughter of the Soul was pretty much based on that piece.
Oh, wow.
Because they were, I got contacted from Earache when they were working on it. They're like, can you send us a PDF of that article? I was like, sure thing.
So as soon as you pay for that advertisement.
Did we say that? It's a free podcast. So there you go. And I actually I think read that feature this morning in preparation for talking about At the Gates, just in case, get my bearings straight, make sure my facts are on fire and stuff. But before we kind of sign off here, personal favorite record or song or anything from At the Gates?
Oh man. It's difficult to narrow them down because they're a band that's gone through so many different phases. There's so many different eras and sounds, and each one of those records is so distinctly different. I can listen to Slaughter of the Soul ad nauseum. You can just put it on and it's just on, and it is a record like Rain and Blood. I have a hard time picking a song from that because I feel like it's straight on through.
It's one album. Yeah, it's one piece of music.
Yeah. I'd hate to do this, but I'd have to go to Kingdom Gone from for me. For like as like a song that like when I think of At the Gates, that's what I think of first. So I think of that record, and I even kind of think of the title track Red in the Sky Is Ours and Kingdom of God together as like almost like one unit. You know, going from the blast that starts off that song to the weird raining violin that like outros it and into Kingdom Gone after that is I mean when I think about the Gates, that's what I normally think of.
Actually, it's funny because I go back to Red in the Sky as well, but a different kind of sequence of songs. They're kind of in the middle or later half of the record. For some reason I've always linked on to Claws of Laughter Dead going into Neverwhere, because I think my entryway into this kind of era of Swedish metal was through like Skydancer. So I was always looking for like, give me melody, give me twin leads just flying out, and Claws of Laughter Dead had some sick like melodic sort of single picking solos and things like that. Neverwhere is just everywhere. So like that was like glue for me, you know. So what about you, Chris?
I think it's sort of bookends, I think, for me, because it's largely probably attached to some experience or emotion. I think Red in the Sky Is Ours, I really like that one because it's so different for the time. It opened my eyes a lot to what was possible with death metal, and I listened to it a lot when it came out, and then I think Red in the Sky Is Ours. No, actually, wrong thing. Slaughter of the Soul. When it came out, I remember it was what, September or October? Maybe it was late August. It was fall.
I have a hard time.
It was fall because I remember driving around in my car, and that was like the first record I could actually blast in my car and not like, I don't know, it didn't sound weird, because it was just really this continuous set of songs that just kind of, like Slayer, Rain and Blood, that it just kept going and going and going, and there was no real break, there was no uncomfortable songwriting, it was just very consistent, and of course the weather was great at the time, and you know I was happy to be driving through the country roads of Michigan with this album just blasting on cassette, and in fact it was Mark's cassette because he got serviced at first from earache, and I was
never heard the end of it,
and I was insanely jealous about that
as well.
Oh yeah, isn't that ironic that Mark had Opeth before Chris?
Wow. Actually he didn't. Actually he had the CD.
I had the CD.
You had the CD, I had the tape a year and a half before you did. But you know, that was definitely like, those are experiences that, you know, I would never forget, because of, you know, the environment, the weather, what we were doing at the time with the magazine, and I think we had a semi-personal relationship with the band. But going back to the original question, I'm going to agree with Albert. I'm going to go back to Red in the Skies. Is ours?
So 3 Red in the Skies so far.
I'm going to go the same as well. So, wow. And I typically don't cherry pick songs. Anytime I listen to music, I listen to full albums.
Right.
So I'm the only guy that can't tell you every single song title. I listen to the whole thing straight through. So
gosh, come on.
I'm a hack. I'm sorry, but no,
you wouldn't make it in the MySpace world.
You wouldn't make it in my world either.
That's what the internet's for. Yeah, that's why I'm not a journalist. But yeah, I definitely just the era that came out, and you know how you felt as, what were we, like 17, 18 years old?
We were, well, I was 17, you were 18.
Yeah, so I mean, just that time and just everything associated with that record, it just felt right. And every time I listen to it again, it just brings back all that kind of like, when, you know, that album was the most important thing in my life at that couple of hours I was listening to it. Nothing else really mattered, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I can see that.
Go with that as well.
So.
And I think it was one of those records too. I mean, not to, you know, it was like, you have a death metal collection, and it's sort of like what you were alluding to earlier, honey. You have a death metal collection, it's kind of cool and whatever, but then you get this record like At the Gates, and it sort of elevates it. It sort of, you know,
justifies why you're into it.
No, I wouldn't even say that. I think it's such a smart record, and I don't even think they knew it was smart at the time. It's one of those things that happened. And I think that, you know, from the lyrics, like Albert mentioned, I think to the production, to the songwriting, to the drumming, to everything about it, the artwork, for example, being that hand with a glowing orb in it, I think it would just made death metal almost legitimized it creatively, in an artistic sense. And almost said death metal is more than just a bunch of dudes, you know, getting out their aggression. It's actually, it could be more.
Yeah, there's more than one emotion.
Absolutely.
On that record.
Yeah.
This is weird. Can you do a Hall of Fame record just off of our opinion? Because I think we just, you know, pretty much nominate for some sort of Hall of Fame status accidentally.
You know, people do talk about like there being a band to have multiple albums in the Hall of Fame. We haven't done it yet.
Certainly.
but I would like to do it someday. And Red in the Sky, I'd be happy to write that.
There you go. You heard it first here, kids. So, all right. Well, it's been a great pleasure having a nice forum here. Usually it's just Mark and I, but it's nice to hear some fresh voices and stuff like that. So we really appreciate you spending some time with us, Albert.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for getting the show kind of organized a little bit in New York and dragging us out here for a reason, So to record the Amorphous podcast, of course.
Exactly.
Right.
So, but thank you, Albert.
Thank you.
Thank you,
can
Chris.
find,
Thank you.
if you want to do an internet plug as well for the site, the
Oh.
Decibel site for subscriptions
Go.
and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Plug time.
Plug time. You can go to decibelmagazine.com, which will take you right now to thedeciblog.com, which is updated daily.
Fun stuff.
Majority of which is written by Chris, in fact, and every once in a while, when I'm not nodding off at my desk, I'll write something on the blog. But there's a forum with a lot of crazy people on it every day. Subscribe. Full web store with back issues and stuff.
And also Choosing Death, which has some parts dealing with the Swedish scene. Correct?
Yeah, I'm terrible at plugging myself. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
In fact, don't bother with Choosing Death. Get Swedish Death Metal, which is a book that's going to be out now. It was out in Europe probably about a year ago.
Quite expensive.
Quite expensive. It cost a couple people in this room $80 a piece.
But it's sold out.
And it's sold out, but now it's getting a proper U.S. release through Bazillion Points. And it's a reasonable $35. It's like 500 pages, and it's amazing.
Yeah.
There's just tons of information.
Who wrote that?
in there. A fellow by the name of Daniel Ekaroth, or Ekaroth, I'm not sure. I defer to the Swedish pronunciation.
I would have to say that. I don't know.
Judges?
But he's an older guy. He's closer to our age. I think he's 35, 36, and he was in the scene. So he has a different perspective when he's writing, as somebody who wasn't actually in the scene and in bands, and with what I did with Choosing Death, he has a different perspective, which is really fascinating.
Yeah.
And it's a great book, and there's a lot of At the Gate stuff in there. There's some At the Gate stuff in Choosing Death too, but there's a lot more in Swedish death metal.
And what's the website again?
Bazillionpoints.com.
Yeah,
Bazillion Points.
Bazillionpoints.com.
Yeah.
And for our Spanish listeners, Choosing Death, the Spanish version is coming out.
Yes, there'll be Choosing Muerte, which will be out also through Bazillion Points. There's a translation that's being worked on right now. I think it's probably going to be early 09.
Great.
Cool.
And I'm trying to write like an extra chapter for it. So if I actually do that, then people who can read Spanish
You get a bonus.
pick it up. You get a bonus.
Yeah.
Will you do an English online chapter posting of the Mexican or the South American scene?
I don't know.
Subscription.
I don't know. Well, there's talk of this.
$5.
And it's only talk from me. I wanted someday. I'd love to do an expanded and revised version of Choosing Death. That's like 100 more pages or something, and correct some things.
Choosing more death.
Yeah, there's a couple glaring errors that kill me in there, and there's a number of typos, and I'd love to go in and clean a few things up as well as expand on some things. And I mean, the fact that the actual writing process for the book ended, in early 2004. So much more has happened since then. There's been what we're talking.
Almost a renaissance.
Yeah, I mean, what we talked about earlier. I mean, we went to an At the Gate show last night. I mean,
Be going to a carcass show pretty soon.
Yeah, and that was not like something I ever imagined would happen when I was putting the book together. So there's this. I mean, between David Vincent back in Morbid Angel, Obituary reforming, At the Gates, Carcass. I mean, if I sat here, I could think of a million
Both are breaking
B-level
up.
bands.
Both are over.
Yeah.
Finally. No, I'm just kidding.
Yes.
Hey, no.
But yeah, that's that, I guess.
Cool. Well, and if you have any comments about our podcast, you can email us at requiempodcast@gmail.com. REQUIEM podcast@gmail.com. So thanks again for our special guests. So I'm Jason.
I'm Mark.
I'm Chris.
No, I'm Albert.
the sky. Earth, frozen in time, nothing aside.